I still remember the way the cold air pressed against my skin that night. My brother, Evan, had just gotten his license. He was 17, proud, cocky, and a little too eager to escape the house. It was one of those dead quiet evenings in mid-October where the wind carries a certain kind of warning sharp, hollow like it's scraping over dry leaves and bones. We'd finished dinner and were both bored out of our minds. Evan had this idea to drive out to the old service roads near the abandoned farm, a place we used to visit as kids but hadn't been near in years. With our parents already asleep and the keys to Mom's car sitting unattended on the counter, it didn't take much convincing. Evan wanted to test out the high beams and his new LED spotlight. He called it spotting deer, but really it was just an excuse to mess around in the woods. I grabbed 2 flashlights and a hoodie, and off we went, slipping out of the house without a sound. The roads got worse the farther we drove, first asphalt, then gravel, and finally a narrow, winding dirt path barely wide enough for the car. Trees crowded the edges, branches scratching the sides of the car like claws. There were no streetlights, not even fence posts. It was like we were driving into the lungs of the forest. We passed a rusted gate that hung open at an angle, and I recognized it vaguely, an old logging access point, long since abandoned. That's when Evan slowed the car and turned off the engine. Everything went silent except for the ticking of the cooling metal and the occasional groan of tree limbs swaying overhead. "No deer," he said, shrugging as he opened the driver's door. "Let's get out and listen for a bit." We stood by the car, flashlights in hand, scanning the brush. The beams caught glimpses of dry grass, snapped branches, the glint of old barbed wire partially hidden by overgrowth. I was starting to think it had been a waste of gas when I heard it, something snapping, maybe a twig or two. It wasn't far either, just a few yards off the trail, deeper in the trees. Evan heard it too. He looked at me, grinned like a kid about to pull a prank, and grabbed the spotlight from the back seat. We both aimed our lights into the woods at the same time, expecting the flick of a tail or the flash of glowing eyes. But instead, the beam settled on something completely different: people. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. There were people, at least a dozen, maybe more, standing there in the trees, still, silent, and staring right at us. None of them moved, not a blink, not a twitch, just their shapes outlined by the flashlight beams, spaced a few feet apart from one another, standing in this uneven arc around a clearing. They were all dressed in dark clothing, faces obscured either by shadows or what looked like smudged cloth or paint. It was impossible to tell. The more I stared, the more wrong it felt. Their arms hung stiffly at their sides, like they'd been standing like that for hours. I whispered, "Do you see that?" Evan didn't say anything. He just backed toward the car. I followed, flashlight still raised, heart pounding so hard I thought it might drown out everything else. The moment we closed the doors, Evan started the engine. He didn't even wait for the headlights to come on, just slammed the gear into reverse and tore down the dirt road like the car was on fire. We fishtailed around the bends, gravel spitting out from the tires, tree branches scraping against the windows. We didn't speak until we hit the main road. Back in the safety of town, the streetlights never looked so welcoming. We sat in the driveway for a long time. Evan finally said, "What the hell was that?" I didn't know what to tell him. Part of me wanted to believe it was some weird cult thing, maybe a group of hikers messing around. But there was something too deliberate about how they stood. Something wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about their faces, or lack of them. Just dark smears where features should have been. We didn't tell anyone. We knew we weren't supposed to be out there in the first place. Trespassing, probably. And besides, who would have believed us? 2 teenage boys out in the woods at night, talking about a crowd of silent people watching them in the dark. It sounded like a bad campfire story. The next morning, I checked online to see if there were any reports gatherings. Cult sightings, anything strange. Nothing. Not a single mention. That made it worse. Weeks passed, then months. We didn't talk about it again. But every now and then, I'd catch Evan staring out his bedroom window at the woods behind our neighborhood. He'd shut the curtains quickly when he realized I noticed. I tried to forget. I really did. But the memory stayed. It wasn't just a fear. It was the silence. That many people, standing in total stillness, not making a sound. It wasn't natural. A year later, I got curious and decided to go back in broad daylight. Alone. Just to see. The gate was gone. No rusted metal. No tire tracks. No trail. The forest had grown over everything, like the road had never existed. I even brought a GPS map and looked at satellite images. There was no record of a logging trail or a service road in that area. Just thick woods. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know if we imagined it or if something wanted to be seen just once. All I know is this. There are places the forest doesn't give back. Roads that disappear. People that stand too still, too quiet, for too long. I haven't gone near that part of the woods since. And neither has Evan. It happened during my junior year of high school. I came down with the flu, nothing unusual at first. A fever, some aches, exhaustion, but it kept getting worse. My temperature spiked to levels that scared my parents. I couldn't keep anything down, and I drifted in and out of sleep like I was underwater. My mom said my skin was hot to the touch, like I was burning up from the inside. By the time they rushed me to the hospital, I could barely stay awake. My last clear memory before checking in was vomiting on the floor of our living room and trying to apologize, but my voice wouldn't come out. At the hospital, everything was chaos. I remember bright lights, nurses moving around quickly, someone taking my vitals, a mask over my face. I heard words like seizure risk and brain damage, as if they were being spoken in a tunnel. Eventually, they got my fever down enough that I was coherent again, but I still felt like my brain was wrapped in fog. A doctor came in, introduced himself, though I instantly forgot his name, and explained that they needed chest x-rays to check for lung damage. He was calm, but had this look in his eyes that said something wasn't quite right. Before I knew it, they were wheeling me down long white halls to the radiology wing. The air felt colder there, like the warmth didn't quite reach that part of the building. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, and everything smelled like rubbing alcohol and plastic. The nurse who was pushing my wheelchair, her name tag said, Carla, parked me beside the massive x-ray machine and smiled politely. Wait here, she said gently. I'll be right back. Just a minute, okay? She stepped out through a heavy door that clicked shut behind her. I sat there in silence, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket that barely covered my lap. My arms felt weak. My legs were much better. I tried to focus on my breathing. In, out. Try not to panic. That's when I noticed someone else in the room with me. She wasn't there when Carla left. I was sure of it. But now, standing near the corner by the cabinets, was another nurse. She looked different. Her scrubs were crisp and perfectly clean, almost like they'd never been worn before. She had long dark hair tied neatly behind her head, and her skin looked pale under the hospital lights, almost too smooth, like porcelain. She smiled softly and tilted her head. "Come with me," she said, her voice low and calm. My body was frozen. Not out of fear exactly, but confusion. "I'm supposed to wait here," I muttered. She took a step closer, still smiling. "Are you sure? It'll only take a moment." There was no malice in her voice, no rush, just that eerie patience. I hesitated, heart beginning to race. Something felt wrong. She wasn't wearing a name tag. Her shoes didn't squeak on the floor like Carla's had. And her eyes, when I finally looked into them, they didn't seem right. They weren't glassy or warm like a human's. They looked reflective, Empty. I shook my head slowly. No, Carla told me to wait here. The nurse didn't get angry. She just stared at me for a second too long, then smiled again, turned toward the corner and walked away. But she didn't open a door. She didn't make a sound. She was just gone. A minute later, the real nurse, Carla, returned with a clipboard in hand. She chatted casually, asking me to sit still as she prepped the machine. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't stop glancing at the corner. It was empty. Nothing was there. No second nurse. No extra exit. Just a wall with a cabinet that hadn't been opened. When I finally asked her, "Hey, who was the other nurse in here earlier?" she blinked. "What other nurse?" she said. I explained. A woman, dark hair, no tag, asked me to come with her. Carla froze for a second before brushing it off. No one else should have been in here. Just me. Doors are locked while we're prepping. Maybe you imagined it, but I didn't. I know what I saw. I remember how calm that woman's voice was, how real she felt. I wasn't delirious anymore, not like earlier. I could tell the difference between a fever dream and a person standing 5 feet in front of me. For a while, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a staff member Carla didn't see. Maybe my brain, still foggy from the fever, was messing with me. But every time I remembered that moment, those strange eyes, that smile, and how she vanished without a trace, it left a chill crawling under my skin. Later, after I was discharged, I tried looking up the hospital history out of curiosity. I found an old forum post from nearly a decade ago. It mentioned a radiology technician who died on the job after a stroke. Alone in the X-ray room, she hadn't been found for hours. The only photo I could find was grainy and small, but the resemblance was undeniable. Same face, same hair, same eerie, calm expression. Some people believe that when you're close to death, something waits for you, something that tries to lead you across. I don't know what would have happened if I'd followed that nurse. If I had stood up, walked toward her, would I have made it back? I said no, and I'm still here. But sometimes I think about how easy it would have been to say yes, how natural it felt, and how many people, too sick or too scared, might have followed her without even thinking. Maybe she wasn't evil. Maybe she was just waiting. It was supposed to be a fun family trip, something we hadn't done in years. My parents had been working nonstop. My older brother, Lucas, was finally back from university, and I had just finished a grueling exam period. So we decided to take a week off and go somewhere we hadn't been before. Somewhere different. Somewhere far. We packed our bags, rented a car in Las Vegas, and crossed the border into northern Mexico. The sun was sharp, the air dry and heavy with dust, and the road stretched endlessly in every direction. It felt like we were leaving everything behind, even time. We weren't completely disconnected. Lucas had planned ahead and picked up a prepaid SIM card that worked in Mexico. He liked to stay in touch with his girlfriend, and I wanted to keep uploading travel photos to my story feed. The SIM worked well enough, and we took turns swapping it between our phones when needed. That's when the first strange thing happened. We were somewhere outside Durango, a narrow desert road with mountains rising like ghosts on either side, when my phone lit up. A text message. I checked the screen and froze. The message wasn't from a number in my contacts. Just a long string of digits, no name, no country code. But it wasn't spam. It didn't even feel random. It started simply, "We love you. We miss you every day. Hope your trip is going well." And then signed at the bottom in perfect spacing, "Love, Omar and Appa." My heart skipped. I hadn't heard those names in years. Omar and Appa weren't just words to us. They were what we called our grandparents when we were little. Our father's side, his parents were German immigrants who lived in Canada most of their lives. Omar was what we used for our grandma, Appa for grandpa. It was a family thing. No one outside our circle used those names. They had both passed within 6 months of each other when I was in middle school. Cancer took Appa quietly, and Omar followed soon after, as if her heart had simply stopped trying once he was gone. It had devastated our family. We used to visit them every weekend, and then suddenly that entire part of our lives was gone. So when I saw that message, something tightened in my chest. It wasn't just weird, it felt intimate, personal, a voice from the past. I showed Lucas. He went quiet immediately, reading the words again and again. "This isn't a joke, right?" I asked. "You didn't send this?" He shook his head, face pale. "No way. That number's not even local." He grabbed the phone and checked the metadata. The message had come through the Mexican network, but the origin was unknown. There wasn't a clear sender ID, just a number that didn't make sense. We tried calling it. Disconnected. We tried replying. Message failed. Our parents laughed it off at first when we told them. "Maybe it's one of those weird automated texts," Mom said. Probably random, but I could tell she didn't believe that. Not really. She had tears in her eyes after reading it. Later that evening, we sat in a small hotel near the coast. The place was old but charming, colorful tiles, swaying fans, and a warm sea breeze leaking through the cracks in the windows. Still, I couldn't sleep. I kept going over that message in my mind. "Hope your trip is going well." How would anyone know we were on a trip? We hadn't posted about it yet. Not the route. Not the timing. Not even the country. No hashtags. No GPS tags. It wasn't online. The SIM card was brand new. We hadn't even shared the number with anyone. That night, I dreamt of Omar's kitchen. The warm smell of gingerbread. The creaking wooden floors. The way she used to hum as she stirred stew on the stove. And Appa in his worn-out chair by the fire, reading the newspaper, always looking over the top of his glasses to make sure we weren't up to something. In the dream, I walked into their old house, but it felt different. Still. Too still. Like they were waiting. But I couldn't speak. I tried to call out, and nothing came out. They just looked at me, smiling, like they had something to say, but no way to say it. When I woke up, it was still dark. The breeze had stopped. The room was too quiet. Lucas was sitting up in bed, staring at his phone. "You got another message?" I whispered. He nodded and turned the screen toward me. Same number. New message. "You're doing great. We're proud of you. Don't be scared." That last part hit like ice. Don't be scared. Scared of what? Lucas said nothing. We didn't wake our parents this time. We just sat there, side by side, trying to make sense of it. Was it some kind of glitch? Was someone spying on us? But how would they know those names? How would they know our private words, our exact situation? The SIM card provider couldn't explain it. When we got back to Las Vegas, Lucas contacted them. They said the number shouldn't have been reachable. It wasn't in any system logs. The text history showed nothing unusual on their end. Just no record. We still have the screenshots. That's all that's left now. Eventually, we stopped getting the messages. They just stopped. We went home. Life returned to normal, or tried to. But something stayed with us. I'd like to believe it was a coincidence. Some strange convergence of data. A ghost in the signal. But deep down, I wonder. I think about Omar's wrinkled hands brushing the crumbs off a table. I think about Appa saying, "Stay safe," every time we left the house. I wonder if, somehow, just for a moment, they reached across whatever wall separates the living from the dead and told us one last time that they were still watching. And I wonder what would have happened if we had tried harder to respond. Maybe nothing. Or maybe something would have responded back. I'm not the type to jump at shadows or go ghost hunting for fun. I work in IT, of all things. Logic, structure, patterns, that's my world. But something happened at work a few weeks ago that I haven't been able to shake. It was so simple, so quiet, and yet It's carved a permanent place in my mind. I work in Norfolk, UK, in an old government building that was repurposed into office space years ago. During World War II, this place served as a military base for the US Army Air Forces. Some of the original structures are still intact, especially the one I work in. They say our server room was once a bomb-proof vault. It used to be the safe room for the officers' mess. That detail always gave the place a kind of weight, like the walls remembered things we didn't. The interior had been modernized, of course. Fluorescent lighting, carpeted floors, humming printers, cheap coffee machines. But under all that, it still felt like a war-era skeleton in a business suit. It happened on a Monday. The office was quiet. Most people had left early due to a local power disruption earlier that morning, but a few of us stayed behind to catch up on reports. I just finished updating some network security protocols and decided to print out a hard copy. Our copier is a monster loud, always overheating, and tucked into the back corridor far from everyone's desks. We keep it there so its endless humming doesn't drive people mad. The corridor to the copier is behind the main office space. If you walk out of our workroom, the hallway splits. Kitchen door to the left, copier hallway to the right. Beyond the copier is nothing but a locked metal door that no one uses. It doesn't even have a keyhole on our side. It's more like a relic than anything else. Anyway, I got up from my desk and left the main room. As I passed the hallway intersection, I glanced left and saw someone stepping out of the kitchen. I didn't think twice. They were wearing something dark, maybe navy or black. I assumed it was Simon or maybe Claire, two of my coworkers, who had also stayed late. The figure turned right, heading down toward the copier, just like I was. I didn't say anything. Figured I'd see them again when I turned the corner. But when I did, the corridor was empty. Completely. I stopped walking. The hum of the copier was there as always, grinding away. But no one else. No footsteps. No doors. No voices. Just the copier and the faint smell of toner. I stood there for a moment, confused. The hallway's short, maybe 15 feet, ending at that locked metal door. There's no side entrance, no closet, no room to hide. If someone had turned down this hallway, they should have been right in front of me. I walked to the end of the hall and checked the door, even though I knew it was sealed. The cold steel felt heavier than usual. I glanced behind me again. Still nothing. My stomach dropped in this strange, slow way, like when you realize your seatbelt's not fastened just as the roller coaster starts to drop. It wasn't fear, exactly more like confusion twisting into unease. I saw someone walk from the kitchen to the copier hallway. I hadn't imagined it. The movement was too clear, too human. I remember the way their arms swung, the shift in weight as they stepped. You don't make that up. Still, I tried to explain it away. Maybe the reflection of a shadow? Maybe someone opened the kitchen door, then walked back in and closed it without me hearing. I went into the kitchen to check. It was empty. The kettle was still warm. Someone had been there recently, but no one now. When I got back to the office, I asked Simon and Claire if either of them had just been by the copier. Both shook their heads. I haven't left my desk in half an hour, Simon said. Claire looked at me and raised an eyebrow. Why? I didn't know how to answer, so I lied. Said I thought I heard someone call my name. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The image kept replaying in my head, someone walking confidently from one hallway to the other, as if they belonged there, as if they'd done it hundreds of times, but no one was there. I even started doubting my own memory. The next day, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I pulled up the internal CCTV footage. We don't usually monitor that side corridor closely, but there's a wide-angle camera above the main door that partially catches the hallway intersection. The footage was dull at first. Me walking out of the main office, turning right. But then I saw it. Just seconds before I appeared, something moved on screen. A dark figure, blurry, barely distinguishable, but there, walking across the hallway, exactly as I remembered. Only, the camera didn't pick up a face. No color, just an outline, but it moved like a person. Then it was gone. And here's the part that truly got to me. When I turned the corner, the figure should have still been in view, caught briefly in the edge of the next camera angle. But it wasn't. Just me. Alone. I never reported it. Didn't tell my manager. But I did some reading after. Turns out that part of the building, the corridor specifically, used to be a connector between the officers' mess and the vehicle yard. There were reports, decades ago, of soldiers sneaking down that way during bombing raids, trying to reach the bomb shelter that later became our server room. Some of them never made it. Now, every time I walk past that corridor, I slow down. Just a little. I always check the kitchen. I always glance toward the copier. And I never go down there if I'm the last one in the building. Because whoever or whatever I saw that day didn't vanish. They just went somewhere I couldn't follow. I used to work night shifts at an old movie theater downtown. One of those places that feels like it's frozen in time. The kind of theater with red velvet curtains, gold trim, and walls that echoed too easily. It wasn't a chain, just a family-run business trying to hold on in a city that had long since moved on to multiplexes and online streaming. The building had been around since the 1940s, and you could tell it smelled like dust and popcorn oil that had soaked into the walls for decades. I mostly worked concessions, cleaning up, refilling the soda machines, locking up after the last showing. I actually liked those late hours. There was something peaceful about walking through the lobby once the crowds were gone. But sometimes, that silence started to feel a little too thick, like the theater didn't appreciate being empty. One night, after the final screening had ended and the last customers had cleared out, I was behind the counter wiping things down. I still remember how quiet it was. No more trailers blasting from the speakers, no laughter from teenagers sneaking into R-rated films, just the hum of the drink cooler and the faint creak of the building settling into itself. I was bent over, scrubbing a stubborn patch of syrup off the tile, when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. I stood up straight, still holding the rag, and glanced across the counter. Someone was walking past. A woman. She had long brown hair and wore a bright red dress, not a casual one either. It was elegant, almost formal, like something out of a vintage film. I saw her clearly, just for a few seconds, as she glided past the concession stand and made her way toward Theater 2. She didn't look at me, didn't slow down. I raised my voice instinctively. "Ma'am, we're closed." No response. She just kept walking. I leaned farther over the counter and called again, louder. "Miss? Hello? You can't go in there." Nothing. Now I was irritated. I walked out from behind the counter and followed her into the hallway that led to the individual theaters. Her red dress had already disappeared around the corner, so I quickened my pace. When I got to the doors of Theater 2, I pushed them open, half expecting to find her standing by the rows of empty seats. But the room was dark, empty. I stepped inside and flipped on the wall lights. Still nothing. I walked up and down the aisles, checking behind each row, peeking toward the screen, even looking behind the curtains. No one. There was no way she could have left without me hearing or seeing the door open. And there weren't any other exits, just that one. I stood there for a long moment, trying to convince myself that maybe she'd walked into a different theater, or somehow slipped out behind me without a sound. But it didn't make sense. I walked back to the lobby, a weird tightness growing in my chest. My heart wasn't racing, exactly, but my body had kicked into that alert state, like it knew something I didn't. My boss, Mark, was sitting in the office going over receipts. I knocked once and leaned in. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Do we still have customers in here?" He looked up, confused. "No, why?" "I just saw a woman walk into Theater 2. Red dress, long hair, She didn't say anything, just walked past me. Mark went quiet. Slowly, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face like this was something he didn't want to talk about. "You said red dress?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Why?" He stared at me for a moment, then nodded to himself. "You're not the first one." That sentence hit harder than I expected. "Wait, what?" "She's been seen before," Mark said, his voice lower now. "Always the same. Long brown hair. Red dress. Quiet. Walks toward Theater 2 or Theater 4. Never anywhere else. Never speaks. Then she disappears." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "So what is it? A prank? A projection or something?" Mark shook his head. "We've checked. Cameras never catch her. The first time was 2 years ago. One of the janitors quit on the spot after seeing her. Said he tried to follow her, but she just vanished. We stopped talking about it because it freaked people out." I sat down in one of the customer chairs in the lobby, still gripping the rag from earlier. Everything suddenly felt different, like the theater had shifted under my feet. "Do you think it's real?" I asked. Mark just shrugged. "I think some things are better left alone." For a few days after that, I didn't want to be alone in the building. I'd find excuses to work in pairs, volunteer to restock supplies during daylight, anything to avoid being in that dark lobby by myself. But the thing that stuck with me wasn't the sighting. It was how calm she looked, how out of place she was. The building felt old, worn down, but she looked untouched by time, like she didn't belong in this world anymore, like she hadn't for a long time. A few weeks later, I was talking to one of the older projectionists who had worked there since the early 90s. I told him, casually, that I had seen something weird. He knew what I meant instantly. He told me a story about a woman who had died in the building decades ago. An accident. No one ever confirmed the details, but rumor had it she was dressed up for a special screening, some anniversary night showing of a classic film, and had fallen down the staircase behind the screen. Broke her neck. Died instantly. He said she used to come with her boyfriend, and they always sat in Theater 2. Every single time. Whether that story's true or not, I'll never know. But I've never looked at that hallway the same way again. The lights don't feel as bright. The silence feels heavier. And every time I hear a creak, I wonder if she's walking past me again, quiet, elegant, always just out of reach. 8 years ago, my partner and I rented a house in a quiet suburb, not far from the city. It was a nice place, affordable, newly painted, with a small yard and just enough room for us and our 8-year-old son, Jamie. It should have been perfect, but from the very beginning, something didn't sit right. Jamie refused to sleep in his room. We'd gone out of our way to decorate it exactly how he wanted: bright green walls, dinosaur posters, glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. He was thrilled with it during the day, always showing it off to visiting family. But when night fell, he'd do anything to avoid going in there. He'd beg to sleep in our bed, sneak into the living room, and pretend to fall asleep on the couch, even claim he felt sick just to stay close to us. We assumed it was just part of the adjustment: new house, new routine, but it never stopped. At first, I'd carry him back to his room after he'd fallen asleep. Most nights, I'd find him right back in hours by morning. After a while, it just became normal for him to start the night in his bed and end up in ours. It caused some disruption, of course. Then one night I told my partner I'd try something different. I'd let Jamie sleep in our bed, and I'd take his room, just for the night, to show him it was safe. I wish I hadn't. That room was small but cozy. The bed was firm, the sheets freshly washed. I left the door cracked open, letting in a faint glow from the hallway. I lay there for a while, scrolling on my phone, trying to wind down. Eventually, I drifted off. It wasn't deep sleep, more like floating just beneath consciousness, where you're aware of your surroundings but too tired to move. That was when I felt something change. The air in the room shifted. It got colder, Not the kind of chill from an open window, but a sudden stillness that wrapped around the bed like a shroud. I opened my eyes, and that's when I saw it. A shape hovered above me. It was too tall to fit the room comfortably and completely black, darker than the shadows in the corners. It wasn't standing or leaning. It was hovering, like it had dropped from the ceiling and hadn't decided whether to stay. There were no facial features, but I could feel it watching me. I tried to move. Nothing. I was paralyzed. I struggled against it, screaming in my mind, willing my fingers to twitch, my chest to rise faster. Anything, but I couldn't even blink. My body was a dead weight. Then I felt it. Hands. Cold, invisible hands wrapping around both my ankles. They weren't gentle. A sudden jerk pulled me down in the bed. The sheets tangled around my legs, but they offered no resistance. I was being dragged slowly, my legs yanked toward the foot of the bed, the rest of me following helplessly. The edge of the mattress bumped under my shoulders, then disappeared entirely as I slipped onto the floor. I couldn't even cry out. My throat burned with the effort, but no sound came. My fingernails scraped across the hardwood. The thing kept pulling. I was dragged out of the bedroom, across the hallway, and toward the staircase. The pressure on my ankles never changed, firm, deliberate. I was being hauled like a sack of flour. My head tilted just enough to glimpse the wall as I passed it, and that's when the panic turned to horror. My feet were lifting off the ground. I wasn't being pulled along the floor anymore. I was being dragged upward, vertically, onto the wall that ran along the landing. My body tilted until my head hung downward. My back pressed against the plaster as I slid higher and higher. It defied physics. I was halfway up the wall feet first, my body bent at an unnatural angle, still completely paralyzed, when the scream finally broke through. It wasn't mine. It was my partner's. The bedroom door flew open, and I saw him standing there in the hallway, frozen in shock. His eyes were wide, and for a second, he didn't move. Then he lunged forward and grabbed me by the waist, yanking me down. As soon as his hands touched me, the invisible grip vanished. I collapsed to the floor, shaking uncontrollably, gasping like I'd just broken through the surface of deep water. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in the living room with the lights on, wrapped in blankets, barely speaking. My partner kept glancing at the stairs, like he expected something to come crawling down. I didn't tell him everything right away, just that I'd had some kind of sleep paralysis episode. But I knew better. It wasn't just in my head. I felt it. The next morning, Jamie came into the kitchen while we were drinking coffee in silence. He looked at us, rubbed his eyes, and said casually, "Did the Black Cape Man come into your room last night?" My partner and I both stared at him. I asked, "What do you mean, Jamie?" He shrugged, like it was obvious. "The Black Cape Man. He watches me when I try to sleep. That's why I don't like my room." My heart nearly stopped. I knelt beside him and asked, "How long have you seen him?" Jamie thought for a moment and said, "Since we moved here." He doesn't talk. He just stands near my bed or behind the closet door. I looked at my partner. He looked back at me, and we didn't say a word. We moved out within the month. Breaking the lease was a hassle, and we didn't get our deposit back, but we didn't care. We found a smaller place on the edge of town. Jamie got a new room, and this time, he slept in it from day one. He never mentioned the man in the black cape again, and I never slept in a child's room again, no matter how safe it looked during the day. Whatever lived in that house, it didn't want Jamie there. And when I stepped in his place, it let me know loud and clear. I was 13 when my grandfather, my pop-up, was diagnosed with prostate cancer. At the time, I didn't really understand what that meant. No one in the family talked about it like it was serious. They downplayed everything, said he was responding well to treatment, that it was caught early, that he'd be fine. I wanted to believe them. I'd never lost anyone before, never even seen someone sick in a hospital bed. To me, Death was something that happened to other people's families, far off, abstract. Not to Pop-Up. Not to us. He was a strong man, full of life even in his 70s. He loved old western spaghetti ones with rugged cowboys and dusty saloons, and he used to hum the theme from The Good, The Bad and the Ugly while making pancakes on Sunday mornings. He had this laugh that filled a room, the kind that made you smile even if you didn't know what the joke was. It was hard to imagine someone like that just fading away. When the doctors finally told us he was being sent home, my parents acted like it was good news. "He's well enough to be with family now," my dad said. "Hospitals are no place for people to heal." Looking back, I understand that it was more about comfort than recovery. But at the time, I didn't know that being sent home could mean the end was near. Every morning, my dad would go over to my grandparents' house to help out with whatever he could. He'd make breakfast, administer medications, sit with Pop-Up while Grandma rested. And then, around lunchtime, he'd come home and ask my sister and me if we wanted to visit. We always said yes. It had become a ritual one that kept things feeling normal, even if nothing really was. Then came the morning that changed everything. I woke up far earlier than I ever did on a weekend. I wasn't startled awake by noise or a nightmare, just this strange heaviness in my chest, like something had pulled me out of sleep on purpose. The first thing I remembered was a dream. It was vivid, but not like any dream I'd had before. It was set in the Old West, or something close to it. Cowboys on horseback. A dusty town square. It didn't make sense. I had never cared about westerns. That was Pop-Up's thing. But there I was, standing in this sepia-toned world, watching a scene unfold that felt more like a memory than a fantasy. Then I saw him. He appeared, clear as day, at the front of the scene. But it didn't feel like he was part of the dream. It was more like he'd stepped into it. Like he wasn't supposed to be there. He didn't say anything, just looked straight at me and moved his mouth. Slowly, deliberately. I couldn't hear the words. There was no sound at all, only the motion of his lips. Then I woke up. I looked at the clock beside my bed. It was 7:30 a.m. May. Way too early for me. My body felt drained, my hands cold. I got up and found my sister already in the kitchen, pouring cereal into a bowl. "You're up early," I said. "So are you," she replied. Neither of us knew what to make of it. My dad came home around noon, just like always. He looked tired, more so than usual, but he smiled when he saw us. "Hey," he said gently. "Do you two want to go see Grandma and Pop-Up?" We nodded. It had become such a routine that the question felt automatic, even unnecessary. But this time, he didn't start the car right away. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, gripping the wheel. Then he turned around and looked at us. "Guys," he said slowly, "I have some news." I'll never forget the pause that followed. How quiet the world felt in that moment, like it was holding its breath. "Pop-Up passed away this morning," my sister gasped. I felt the air drain from my chest. "He died?" I was stunned, not just because I thought he was getting better, but because I knew the moment he had passed. I remembered the dream, the western setting, the way he appeared just outside of it, the way he had mouthed something to me goodbye, and the time, 7:30. I didn't say anything in the car, but the realization settled over me like a weight. I wasn't imagining it. He came to say goodbye. There was something else too. Something my dad told us later that day. Our dog, Lucky, a scrappy little Jack Russell who went everywhere with Dad, had been at my grandparents' house that morning. Normally, Lucky would crawl under the hospital bed where Pop-Up lay and stay there quietly for hours. He'd gotten used to the strange new energy of the house, to the medications and quiet voices. But that morning was different. As my dad sat beside his father, holding his hand, Lucky suddenly emerged from under the bed. He walked a few feet away, then stopped and howled. It wasn't a bark or a whine, It was a full, echoing howl. Then he looked across the room toward an empty corner and kept staring. Dad said it gave him chills. Seconds later, Pop-Up took his last breath. I don't think it was coincidence. None of it. The dream. The time. Lucky's howl. Something had shifted that morning. Something beyond what we could explain. A few years later, when I was older, I told my dad about the dream. I expected him to dismiss it, or maybe try to rationalize it. But he didn't. He just nodded, his eyes a little wet, and said, "He loved you. You know." That sounds like something he would do. We sat there for a while without speaking. The TV was on in the background, but I wasn't listening. I just kept thinking about that dream, how Pop-Up had appeared so deliberately, how his mouth had moved in slow, purposeful silence. It hadn't felt like a normal dream. It felt like he had reached out to me from somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't see but could briefly sense. He always hated goodbyes, Dad added eventually. Even when we were kids, he used to say, "I'll see you later," because goodbye made it sound like it was forever. I realized then that was probably why he hadn't spoken out loud in the dream. Maybe he didn't want it to be a goodbye either. That moment with my dad was the first time I felt like I wasn't crazy. Like I hadn't just made up some comforting story to cope with grief. He believed me, or at least, he believed in the possibility of what I'd experienced. And honestly, that meant everything. Years have passed since Pop-Up died. We still talk about him often, especially around holidays, when the absence of his booming laugh becomes more obvious. My grandma passed not long after, and Lucky, our little Jack Russell, died a few years later. But I still remember that morning, the dream, the time, the way the room felt too quiet at breakfast, and the way I somehow knew before anyone told me. Since then, I've become more open to things I don't fully understand. I've never been one for ghost stories or seances, but I believe there are moments, brief, fragile ones, when the barrier between this world and the next gets thin. Just enough for someone we love to step through, if only for a second. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd understood what he was saying in the dream before I got the news. Would I have told someone? Would I have believed myself? I think about how gentle his presence felt. Not haunting, not cold, just final, kind. When people talk about death now, I don't immediately think of hospitals or funerals. I think of a quiet Western dream, a man I loved silently mouthing goodbye, and a little dog howling at something only he could see. And I think maybe, just maybe, that was his way of making sure I'd never forget the last thing he wanted me to know, that he was leaving, and that he loved me. It was the winter of 2012. And I was working weekend night shifts at a petrol station in a fairly average-sized town in England. The job wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent, especially for a college student like me. I had bills to cover, books to buy, and classes to get through. So while my friends were out getting drunk and stumbling through clubs, I was standing behind a thick glass counter, scanning packets of crisps and watching the hours drag by one customer at a time. The routine was always the same. Serve the late-night taxis and tired drivers, restock the shelves when it got quiet, wipe down counters, and try not to fall asleep standing up. By 2 or 3 in the morning, the streets would be mostly dead. The station was across the road from an old pub, and just beside us was a narrow alleyway that led to a housing estate in the back. That alley always made me uneasy, even during the day. It was long, poorly lit, and sloped slightly downhill so you couldn't see all the way to the end unless you were standing directly in it. At night, it became this shadowy tunnel that seemed to swallow everything around it. That night started out like any other. Cold, quiet, and dark. By around 3 Amas, I'd finished wiping down the snack shelves and was about to take a short break. I glanced up, casually checking the CCTV monitors out of habit, and then I noticed something odd. Someone was standing in the alley, At first, I didn't think much of it. Just a shadowy figure leaning slightly, not moving. He was just out of reach of the nearest streetlight, his face hidden in darkness, but I could make out the shape of his coat, long and dark, and the outline of a beanie or hood. I figured he was probably waiting for a taxi, maybe coming from the pub. It wasn't unusual. But what was unusual was how long he stood there. 20 minutes passed, then 30. I served a couple of late-night drivers, cleaned up a coffee spill, and when I looked again, he was still there, same spot, same posture, completely motionless. By 4:30, I started to feel it, that creeping unease in your gut that whispers something isn't right. My station had a secure lock-in after 10 p.m. Thick reinforced windows, locked doors, everything monitored. I was technically safe inside, but I didn't feel safe. I kept glancing out the side window, half expecting him to move, to approach, to wave or signal. But he didn't. He didn't even shift his weight. He was just watching, facing the petrol station. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was drunk and confused. Maybe he was waiting for someone who never showed. But even drunk people moved. They stumbled, sat down, smoked, checked their phones. This guy was a statue. At 5 a.m, I finally looked away for more than a minute. I sat behind the counter and distracted myself with a few games on my phone. I remember forcing a yawn and glancing at the clock 5:03. The moment I looked up again, he was still there, still watching. It felt like a pressure building behind my eyes. I wanted to do something called a non-emergency line, maybe alert the pub security if they were still around, but I kept hesitating. What would I even say? There's a man standing in the dark and I feel weird about it. But that gut feeling never left. The kind that makes your skin crawl without touching it. Eventually, I decided to skip my last assigned task, taking out the fire extinguishers and sand buckets for the morning shift. They were supposed to be placed outside before sunrise as part of station safety protocol. But that would have required me to unlock the front door and step out onto the pavement right in view of the alley. No chance in hell. Around 6 a.m., the light was starting to shift. That deep, eerie blue just before dawn. The street lamps looked weaker, and the sky began its slow transition into gray. That was when I saw it. The man moved. He didn't walk away or turn. He just slowly faded back into the alley, one step at a time, until the darkness swallowed him completely. No car pulled up. No door opened. He just disappeared. A few minutes later, my coworker arrived to begin the morning shift. She unlocked the side entrance with her key and strolled in, shivering and rubbing her hands. "Morning," she said. "You look rough." I tried to laugh, but my throat was tight. I told her what had happened, about the man in the alley, how he stood there for hours without moving. She frowned, looked through the window toward the alley, then back at me. "That's creepy as hell," she said. "I've never seen anyone like that during my shifts. But now I'm going to be paranoid every time I walk past that alley." I didn't respond. I was already texting for a taxi home. I usually walked. It was only a 7-minute stroll back to my flat, but not that day. Not after that night. When I got home, I kept checking over my shoulder. I even locked the bathroom door while I showered, which I'd never done before. I told my family later that afternoon. My dad laughed nervously and said, "Probably just some guy waiting for someone." But my mom looked more serious. "Sometimes," she said, "you just know when something's wrong. You don't need proof." I kept working that job for a few more months, but I never stopped thinking about that figure. I avoided looking at the alley on future shifts. If I saw someone even remotely standing near it, I'd keep my eyes down and pretend I didn't. That sense of being watched never completely went away, even in full daylight. When summer came and I got accepted to university, I gave my notice and left the job. I never went back, not even to fill up my tank. To this day, I don't know what he wanted. if he was just some lost soul or something worse. But I still see that shape when I close my eyes sometimes. The stillness, the silence, the sense that if I'd opened that door, he would have done something terrible. So, to the man in the alley, wherever you are, let's not meet again. I couldn't sleep. It had been a few nights in a row where my thoughts wouldn't shut up, and my chest felt tight for no clear reason. I'd been visiting a new city somewhere far from home, 1,500 miles away, and the change of scenery hadn't brought the peace I'd been hoping for. My body was tired from the long drive, but my mind? It was sharp in the worst way, gnawing on the same loop of urges, guilt, and rationalizations. I'd been clean for a while, but not perfectly. I'd been on and off opiates for a couple of years, never anything that wrecked me completely, but just enough to make everything feel distant and fuzzy when I needed it. That night though, after all the tension, the loneliness, and the emotional exhaustion, I cracked. I opened Craigslist of all things and posted an ad. Just a casual inquiry. Looking for something to relax, will pay. Discreet. Within minutes, I had a few replies, most of them vague or clearly spam. But then, there was one that felt different. It was worded clearly, casually. A man claiming he could help, leaving behind a phone number and saying we should talk. I should have walked away. But I called. He picked up on the first ring. His voice was calm, polite, even friendly. He didn't sound like a dealer. He sounded like an office worker calling in for a lunch reservation. There was a strange normalcy in the way he spoke that made me let my guard down. We talked details. He told me what he had, what the prices were, where he preferred to meet. He suggested a public place, a small cafe in a neighborhood not far from where I was staying. Neutral ground, he called it. Safe for both of us. He described himself in detail. Tall, salt and pepper hair, clean clothes, polite demeanor. Said he'd be wearing a black jacket and a tan baseball cap. It sounded reasonable, too reasonable. After we hung up, I started driving. The address checked out on Google Maps, the cafe existed, and the area wasn't a bad part of town. But something started to itch at the back of my brain as I sat at a red light near the highway exit. I glanced down at the email again and noticed he had signed it. Joseph Jones. It sounded fake. Too fake. A cartoonish fake name. I mean, who actually signs off a Craigslist drug deal with their full name? That nagging feeling began to crawl deeper into my gut. I pulled into a gas station and parked. Something told me to check. Just a quick search, I figured. Nothing would come up. Probably a dead end. But then it did. One of the first search results was a mugshot. The same name, Joseph Jones. And beneath it, bold as day, convicted sex offender. I clicked on the link with my fingers trembling. 3 counts of drugging and sexually assaulting women. Convicted. Multiple victims. The photo matched the description. Same hair, same frame. The article had been published just 2 years ago. My heart sank. That was the exact man I was about to meet. I had spoken to him on the phone. I had told him roughly where I was staying. I had almost gone through with it. My hands were suddenly ice cold on the steering wheel. I looked up through the windshield and watched him walk past my car. He didn't see me. Not yet. But he was real. He walked straight into the cafe, the tan cap sitting neatly on his head, black jacket zipped all the way up. I could see him glance around casually through the cafe's window, just like someone waiting for a friend. My chest felt like it was collapsing inward. I didn't think. I peeled out of that parking lot, like my life depended on it because maybe it did. I drove in the opposite direction, hands shaking, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I didn't stop until I was 10 blocks away, parked beside a dumpster, gripping the steering wheel and trying not to cry. I had never come so close to something so evil. It wasn't just the drugs. It was everything. The trust, the opening, the vulnerability, I was in a strange city, alone, emotionally drained, and had just offered myself up to a predator without realizing it. What scared me most was how normal he sounded, how calm, how practiced. I thought about what could have happened if I'd gotten out of my car, if I'd walked up to him, if I'd followed him somewhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been one wrong step away from vanishing. I sat there for almost an hour, trying to breathe. Eventually, I made it back to my hotel room and just curled up in bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, imagining 100 awful versions of that night. The next morning, I walked into a Narcotics Anonymous meeting nearby. I didn't plan it. I didn't rehearse a speech. I just sat in the back until it was my turn, and when I opened my mouth, everything spilled out. I told them what I had almost done, what I had almost walked into, and how ashamed I felt not just of the addiction, but of how close I'd come to throwing everything away over one moment of weakness. People didn't judge me. They nodded. A few even cried. I'd been clean since then. It wasn't just that Joseph Jones was a predator. It was that he reminded me what the edge looks like. What it feels like to be seconds away from disappearing down a hole that doesn't always have a bottom. That night changed me, not just because I escaped something horrible, but because I realized how easily addiction blinds you to danger, how easy it is to mistake convenience for safety, or kindness for trust. Now, when I get cravings or when the urge creeps back, I think of that night, that cold parking lot, that email, and those words under his photo, convicted. And then I remember, I got away. Barely, but I did. This happened a few years ago, and even now I still don't like talking about it. It was subtle at first, easy to brush off, easy to doubt, but after a while, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Something strange was happening in my house. Something that didn't belong. It started one night while I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. I've always been a light sleeper, the kind who wakes up if someone just walks past the door. That night, I heard footsteps coming into my room, slow, deliberate steps on carpet. Not heavy, but enough to wake me. I opened my eyes instantly. There was someone standing in the doorway of my closet. It was dark, so I couldn't make out the face. But I recognized the shape immediately. It looked like my dad. Same build, same way of standing, just silent. I didn't feel scared at first. My dad had a habit of teasing my mom when she was doing chores, sneaking around and joking with her. So I assumed he was just messing with her again and for some reason had walked into my room as part of it. A second later, my mom walked in carrying a pile of laundry. She smiled at me and said, "Hey, sweetheart, got your laundry?" I sat up a little, half pointing toward the closet. "Dad's hiding in the closet. He's trying to scare you again." She looked at me, confused. Then she looked at the closet. There was no one there. I waited for the laugh, the moment where Dad would jump out or admit he was goofing around. But nothing happened. Mom walked over and opened the closet door fully, stepped inside even, turned on the closet light. Empty. She came back out, still wearing that weird look. "Honey," she said slowly, "he's in the garage fixing the sink. He hasn't been anywhere near room." I didn't say anything. She left a few seconds later, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, eyes wide, heart pounding, staring at the spot where I know I saw someone standing. That night, I left my bedroom light on, and I kept it on every night after that, for weeks. I tried convincing myself it was a dream, a vivid one, maybe even a case of waking up in the middle of REM sleep. But it didn't feel like that. It had felt real. It had looked real, and that wasn't the last time. A few days later, something similar happened. It was a quiet morning. I'd woken up early, went to the bathroom, and as I was heading downstairs, I passed by the hallway and saw someone walking into the bathroom. Just a shadow, really. But it looked like my younger brother, same build. same walk. I even heard the door close behind him, so I didn't think anything of it. I went downstairs, expecting to wait for him to finish so I could grab my toothbrush and come back up. But then I saw him. He was sitting at the kitchen table, eating cereal, already dressed, like he'd been awake for a while. "Wait, didn't you just go to the bathroom?" I asked. He shook his head. "What? No, I've been down here." I stared at him for a long second, then turned around and went back upstairs. The bathroom door was still closed. I knocked. No response. I opened it slowly. No one inside. Nothing. The mirror wasn't fogged up. The lights were off. The toilet lid was down. Everything looked untouched. I stood in the hallway for a while, then went back downstairs, trying to act normal. But something had changed in me. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. It was like a shadow of my family was moving around when they weren't looking, pretending to be them when I was alone. I started doing research, not ghost stories exactly, but experiences similar to mine. That's when I came across the term shadow people. The descriptions were too close for comfort. People described seeing tall, dark figures in the corners of rooms, or catching a glimpse of someone who looked like a family member, only to find out the person was somewhere else. Some called them spirits, others thought they were interdimensional beings. But the one thing that kept repeating over and over in these stories was that the shadows often mimicked people. They didn't just float or linger. They acted like someone you knew. That's when I stopped trying to explain it away. Something was moving through my house that didn't belong, and it knew who we were. The strangest part? It never felt aggressive. I was scared, yes, but more from confusion than danger. The figures never got close. They never touched me. They never spoke. They just appeared and disappeared. One time, I thought I saw my mom sitting on the edge of my bed in the middle of the night. Her silhouette was there, perfectly still. I was too tired to speak, so I just closed my eyes again. In the morning, I asked her why she came into my room. She looked at me, puzzled. "I didn't," she said. "You were fast asleep." After that, I started sleeping with a dim lamp on one of those salt crystal lights. I rearranged my furniture so my bed didn't face the closet anymore. I started avoiding looking down hallways when the lights were off. Even now, I still can't stand pitch black rooms. I never told my parents the full story. What was the point? They'd either worry too much or brush it off. But I'll never forget those weeks. How something in my house wore the shape of my family and moved in the dark when no one else was looking. It eventually stopped. Or maybe I just stopped seeing it. But to this day, if I catch a shadow out of the corner of my eye that doesn't make sense, I don't look twice. Because I already know it's not really my dad. It's not my brother. It's not anyone I know. And I'd rather not see its face. I was around 15 or 16 when this happened. And to this day, I've never experienced fear like that again. It was the kind of terror that takes root in your bones. The kind that makes you feel like even remembering it could somehow bring it back. That summer, my mom and I were taking a long drive to visit an old friend of hers, someone she'd known for years but hadn't seen in a while. I didn't remember much about him, except that his name was Bill, and he lived far out in the countryside in a small wooden cabin surrounded by woods. Mom had always described him as a gentle giant, kind-hearted but tough. A guy who could build a house with his bare hands and still make a stew that could win awards. It was a long trip, almost entirely through rural roads. The sky had already turned a deep navy by the time we hit the last stretch of woods. There were no other cars, no buildings, no cell signal. Just trees on both sides and a dirt road lit by our headlights. Mom had brought an extra gas can in the back, just in case, and at around 11 p.m., we had to use it. I was dozing in the passenger seat when I woke to the loud clang of the gas can being set down. The car was off. We were completely alone. The forest around us was pitch black, and the only light came from the dome light above the car and the flashlight Mom had brought. She told me to stay in the car while she poured the gas. I remember sitting up, rubbing my eyes, when I heard something so loud and bizarre, it made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It sounded like a guttural growl mixed with a roar, like a man yelling through gritted teeth, but distorted and human. It echoed through the trees and made the windshield vibrate. Mom froze mid-pour. Her body tensed, and she looked toward the trees, scanning the darkness. She didn't say anything, just screwed the cap back on and grabbed the flashlight. She shined it in every direction, but couldn't see anything beyond the first row of trees. I saw her hesitate, and that's when I realized she was scared too. She told me again, from this time, to stay in the car, then disappeared briefly behind the vehicle with the flashlight scanning the roadside. She was gone for maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like an hour. When she came back, her face was pale. She didn't say what she saw, only that we were leaving now. I asked what the noise was, but she just shook her head and turned the ignition. Even now, years later, she still won't talk about what happened in those few minutes. We reached Bill's place just after 4 a.m. The cabin sat in a clearing, hidden behind thick trees. It was the kind of place that looked like it was built out of stories log walls, a stone chimney, and a wide porch that creaked under your feet. In front of the house was a beautifully crafted gazebo made of solid walnut. Bill had built it himself, apparently. Beyond the gazebo, the woods stretched again, thick, endless. Bill was exactly as my mom had described. Towering, solidly built, but with a gentle voice and a laugh that made you feel safe. He welcomed us like family and immediately offered food, warmth, and a place to rest. After a few hours of sleep, the 3 of us spent the day chatting, walking the grounds, and enjoying the quiet. It felt peaceful, like nothing bad could touch this little bubble in the woods. That illusion didn't last. That night, we sat outside under the gazebo. Bill had made stew thick, hearty, packed with flavor, and we'd eaten around 10 p.m. By 11, I was feeling drowsy but happy, lulled by the calm breeze and the sound of crickets in the trees. And then I saw something. Far off, barely noticeable at first, 2 red dots in the forest. They weren't high off the ground, but they weren't low either. About eye level. They glowed steadily, and they were spaced just far enough apart to look like eyes. Staring. I didn't say anything at first, thinking I was seeing things. But then Bill stood up suddenly and squinted toward the woods. "You see that?" he said to Mom. She nodded. "Go inside," he said, already heading toward the cabin. But then he stopped, turned, and grabbed his shotgun from behind the porch door. "Stay close," he told us. We followed him cautiously toward the tree line. I didn't want to, but being alone seemed worse. As we entered the woods, the air got colder. Not just cooler cold, like walking into a meat locker. My breath started to show in front of my face, even though it was the middle of summer. Then the flashlight flickered and died. Bill cursed under his breath. Mom grabbed my arm tightly, and we stopped. I could barely see anything, but I could feel how close the trees were, how dense the darkness had become. Bill stood in front of us, silent, listening. That's when we heard it. A shriek, high-pitched, desperate, guttural. It pierced the air like a siren and echoed through the woods, bouncing between trees. It was the sound of pain, of loss, of rage. Then we saw her, just for a second. A woman or something shaped like one. Long black hair hanging over her face, white robe stained with something dark blood. Maybe. Her mouth wide open as she screamed, though her eyes were gone. Empty sockets. She stood a few feet away, arms out, trembling, and cried, "Where are my babies?" Bill raised the shotgun and fired into the trees. The sound shattered the night. But when the smoke cleared, she was gone. The temperature rose instantly. The pressure in the air lifted, like someone had been holding their hand on our chests and finally let go. We turned and ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind us. Bill locked every bolt, every window, every latch. None of us spoke for a while. Bill sat at the table, hands shaking, gun still across his lap. My mom hugged me like I was 5 again, and I cried harder than I have in years. It was like all the fear that had built up came pouring out at once. We didn't sleep that night. Just sat in the cabin, lights on, waiting for morning. And when the sun came up, everything looked normal again. Peaceful. The trees were green. The breeze was warm. Birds chirped. But I knew what I saw. And I know we weren't meant to. Bill later told us there had been stories about those woods for generations. About a woman who'd lost her children to illness or something worse, and who was said to wander the forest, searching for them still, crying, screaming, lashing out at anyone who got too close. I don't care what anyone says. That night, we got too close, and she saw us. It was last school year when things started happening, small things at first, nothing wild enough to tell a teacher or report to anyone. But they stuck with me. They built up. And the more I talked to others, the more I realized I wasn't the only one noticing strange things at our school. It all started during one of our band classes. Our usual practice room had been repurposed that week because of standardized testing. So we were moved to the auditorium, a big space usually reserved for school plays, assemblies, and once a year, the graduation ceremony. At first, I was excited. I'd always loved the way sound echoed there, how every note from my flute carried up into the rafters and came back soft and ghostly. But that day, it didn't feel right. It felt colder than usual, not just because of the old air conditioning. It felt like the kind of cold that seeped into your skin. We were only about 15 minutes into practice when the first weird thing happened. The auditorium has 2 main doors, one on each side of the stage. Both had been left propped open, wide enough that you could see the hallway light spill in. Out of nowhere, both doors slammed shut. At the same time, we all jumped. Even the teacher paused. She looked toward the doors, confused. "That's odd," she said, trying to brush it off. Someone joked that it was just a draft, but the air was still, dead still. And those doors are heavy stiff on their hinges. You couldn't close them both that quickly without force. The teacher made a half-hearted comment about maybe the bathrooms nearby causing air pressure shifts or something. But we all knew there weren't many students in the halls. Most were locked into testing rooms. And even if it was airflow, it shouldn't have happened like that. We moved on. Sort of. Later in the same class, I was sitting near the edge of the stage when I saw something strange on the ground in front of me, like a shadow, only paler. It wasn't cast by anyone or anything. It just drifted across the floor, slow and smooth, and disappeared. At first, I thought maybe my eyes were just playing tricks on me, but I wasn't afraid. I was just puzzled. I didn't say anything. Not then. It wasn't until we were putting away our instruments after class that I overheard 2 other girls talking. They were whispering, almost like they didn't want to admit what they saw. "Did you see that figure near the back?" one of them said. "It looked black, like it was just standing there." The other nodded. I thought it was someone watching us. I immediately cut in. "You saw something too?" They both looked at me, wide-eyed. "I saw something move across the ground," I told them. But it was white, almost like smoke. That moment changed everything for me. I wasn't imagining it. Other people saw it too, and they'd seen different versions. Some saw black, some saw white, some saw nothing, but felt it. But we were all experiencing something. And the thing is, this wasn't the first time people had whispered about our school being haunted. There's this local rumor that a kid died in the building years ago around the bathrooms near the auditorium. No one talks about it officially, but students pass the story around like a secret. The details always change. Some say he fell and hit his head. Others say it was something darker. But no one denies that something happened. After that day in the auditorium, more stories started surfacing. One of the guys I'm friends with, the kind who's always joking around, always acting like nothing gets to him, came up to me the next week and said something that made my skin crawl. "You won't believe what I saw near the boys' bathroom," he said. "It was after lunch. I was alone in there. The lights flickered, and I swear something moved past the stall door." I asked what it looked like. He shrugged, but he didn't smile like he usually did. "It didn't have a face," he said. "It was just tall, like a shadow shaped like a person, but it moved too fast." He'd been brushing it off, pretending to be cool about it, but I could tell it had gotten to him. Then, a few days later, he decided to do something stupid. "Ghostbuster move," he called it. Basically, he dared himself to go into the bathroom during the last period of the day alone and call the ghost out. I wasn't with him, being a girl and all, so I only heard what happened afterward. He came out pale, actually pale, and said something had left a handprint on the inside of the mirror. Not on the foggy part, there wasn't steam, just a smudge that looked like fingers. The kicker? He hadn't touched the mirror. No one had. I still didn't want to fully believe it. I wanted to be skeptical, logical. But things kept happening. Doors creaking open in empty classrooms. Lights flickering in perfectly working bathrooms. Faucets turning on by themselves. Shadows showing up in mirrors. And always near the auditorium or the bathrooms. It wasn't malicious, at least not yet. It never hurt anyone, but it watched. It moved just enough to let you know it was there. I tried to talk to a teacher once. She laughed. Said kids have always thought schools were haunted. Said it was just the building settling, old plumbing, our imaginations. But she didn't make eye contact when she said it. Now, whenever we have band practice in the auditorium, I sit closer to the middle. Not near the edges, not near the doors. I don't stare too long into the back rows. I don't use the bathrooms near the auditorium anymore, either. I'd rather walk the extra hallway to the main ones near the front office. Some of my friends think the whole thing is made up. Others swear they've seen or heard whispering when no one else was around. Seen lockers slam shut when the hallway was empty. For me, it's not about proof anymore. It's about that moment when you see something impossible and then hear someone else say they saw it too. That's when you know you're not crazy. And that's when you realize something really is there. My dad is the kind of man who doesn't scare easily. He's practical, logical, the type to roll his eyes at ghost stories and superstitions. That's why, when he told me what happened to him back when he was a student working in the Hanneman building in Liverpool, I knew he wasn't exaggerating. Something happened to him there, something that shook him in a way few things ever had. The Hanneman building has stood in Liverpool since 1887, originally a general hospital and dispensary focused on alternative medicine. It's now part of the university and used for arts and administrative offices. But parts of its original form remain, especially the basement. When my dad worked there, that basement still held remnants of its former life, including the morgue. He was a student at the time and took a custodial job helping to clean and maintain the building after hours. He'd often be the last person there, locking up various rooms and washing up equipment. His usual routine included heading to the basement, what used to be the morgue, to clean the paintbrushes left behind by art students. It was quiet, always a little too dark, and filled with the faint scent of age and dust. The sink was conveniently located next to a large old Victorian stone mortuary table. He never liked it, but over time, the creepiness dulled. You see something long enough, you stop reacting to it. The morgue didn't bother him nearly as much as the elevator. There was an old lift in the building, one of those manually operated things with thick sliding doors and a slow, grinding ascent. He used it instead of the stairs, mostly out of habit, even though he always joked that one day it might just decide to stop working while he was inside. It was late one evening when it happened. He'd just finished washing up in the basement, alone as usual. He realized he'd forgotten a set of keys on the top floor. Tired and wanting to finish up quickly, he took the elevator rather than the stairs. As the lift groaned its way upward, he checked his watch, thinking about what he had left to do before heading home. Then, the elevator stopped. The doors slid open with a mechanical jolt, and something walked past. Not something in the vague sense he saw it, clear as day. A man, or what looked like one. He was wearing a black cloak, the kind that billows slightly as you move. His shoulders were rigid, his posture stiff and upright. And on his head, he wore a tall, old-fashioned top hat. He didn't turn, didn't glance inside. He just marched straight past the elevator and down the hallway with long, purposeful strides. And there was wind. My dad swears he felt a breeze as the figure passed. Not from the building, no windows were open, and the corridor had no airflow. But something about the man's passing left the air disturbed, like he had pushed through the world with weight. It lasted only seconds. The figure vanished down the hallway, and the sound of footsteps disappeared with it. My dad stood there, frozen. It wasn't until the elevator tried to close again that he snapped out of it. He stepped out, walked slowly to the hallway, and looked around. Nothing. The corridor was empty. All the office doors were shut and locked. No lights flickering. No sign that anyone else had been there. As part of his job, he had to check every room before locking up. He did so meticulously. Opened every door, checked every corner, called out just in case someone was still inside. But the building was empty. Now, here's the part that still gets me. My dad is a skeptic. Even after all these years, he still doesn't claim he saw a ghost. He'll tell the story, but he'll follow it with, I don't know what it was. Maybe a trick of the light. Maybe someone in costume. Maybe my mind was tired. But every time he tells it, his voice changes when he gets to the hallway. His words slow down. His eyes lose focus for a second. He remembers it. Exactly. He remembers the cloak, the top hat, the breeze. He remembers how no one could have gotten out of that hallway without him seeing. He remembers locking every door afterward, alone in the building. He remembers the way the silence returned heavier than before. There had always been ghost stories about the Hanneman building. Whispers among students, strange noises from the basement, sightings of figures in old-fashioned clothes. But he had always ignored them, until that night. He still doesn't have an explanation. And honestly, neither do I. But sometimes, when I think about that building, about how it once held the dead in its walls, I wonder if something lingered. Not a spirit exactly, but a memory. A presence carved so deep into the stone that even time couldn't scrub it out. And maybe, just maybe, my dad caught a glimpse of that memory as it walked its path one more time through that hallway, past the elevator, and into whatever darkness it came from. I've always been the cautious type. The kind of girl who walks with her keys between her fingers, always glances behind her, and keeps her earbuds out when walking at night. Some call it paranoid. I call it surviving. Especially in my small port town, where the streets are either scorched with heat or soaked in rain, and where the buses were always crowded with tired students, oddball commuters, and the occasional creep who made your skin crawl. I was 17 the first time it happened. It was a long ride home from school, the usual 2-bus journey that I could do half asleep by that point. That day, I was sitting by the window, watching the scenery blur past in a humid haze, half lost in thought. My umbrella rested on my lap, always ready, just in case. In my town, it was just as useful for sudden downpours as it was for fending off weirdos. The bus stopped. Someone got on and took the seat beside me. At first, I didn't pay attention, until I felt it, that instinctive tug in my chest that told me something was wrong. I turned to look. He was short, with deep brown skin and an unkempt appearance. He stared directly into my eyes. Not a glance. Not a look around. Just straight into my face, like he was trying to read my mind. I felt my grip tighten around the umbrella handle. I looked away, heart beginning to race, pretending not to feel like a deer cornered by something it couldn't outrun. Then he pulled out his phone and played music. But it wasn't anything I recognized. The melody was slow, offbeat, eerie. It was just a piano, playing in uneven keys, like a music box winding down in a haunted house. Underneath the music, I heard vocals. They weren't in English. In fact, I couldn't place the language at all. It was low, mournful, strange. He bobbed his head along with it, as if he were listening to a catchy pop tune, not a song that felt like it belonged in a funeral parlor. No one else on the bus seemed to notice. Every so often, he'd turn and smile at me. Not a friendly smile, a knowing one. Like we shared something. Like he knew I was listening. Like he was playing that music just for me. I sat frozen the entire ride. I was too afraid to say anything. I didn't want to confront him. I didn't want to speak to him. I just wanted the ride to end. When the bus finally slowed at my stop, I practically leapt out of my seat. I swear I felt his hand graze the back of my leg as I stood. I didn't look back. I sprinted off the bus and made my way toward the stop for my second bus home, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. That's when I heard it. "Excuse me, can I talk to you?" His voice, behind me. I didn't turn around. I walked faster. He kept pace, repeating it again and again, as if he couldn't understand why I wasn't responding. "Excuse me, can I talk to you?" I slipped, scraped my knee on the pavement, but I got back up and kept walking, breath shallow, heart threatening to leap out of my chest. Then, like some small mercy, the second bus pulled up. I ran to it, got inside, and collapsed into the very last seat. I turned to look out the window. He was standing there, staring at me again. Just staring. The music had stopped, but the silence was worse. That was the last time I saw him, at least for a while. I didn't tell anyone. What could I even say? That a weird man played music at me and followed me? I let it go. Time passed. I moved on. Or tried to. 3 years later, I was in college. I'd moved into a hostel and traveled home every other weekend. My town was even further away now, and it took 3 different buses to get there. It had been a long week. I just wanted to go home and rest. The first bus wasn't crowded. I took a window seat again, earbuds in, just watching the world pass. Then someone boarded and sat next to me. Even though the bus was mostly empty, I didn't look at him at first. Just noticed the seat shift and his presence beside me. After about a minute, he got up and moved to the seat in front of me. I barely registered it until the second bus. Different line, different stop, different passengers, and he got on again. He sat next to me again. This time, he leaned over and asked, "Where's this bus going?" Which made no sense. You get your ticket before boarding. You know the route. I didn't answer. I just stared at my hands. He got up and got off. Relief hit me like a wave. But as soon as the bus pulled away from the curb, he jumped back on and took the seat behind me. I was frozen again. It couldn't be happening again. Not after 3 years. Not here. The rest of that ride blurred into anxiety and sweat. I stared at my phone the whole time, trying to distract myself with games, with anything, while he sat behind me, silent. And then the third bus. Last leg of the journey. It was already past 7, and the sun was setting. I boarded quickly. The seats were mostly full now, as this was a local bus in my hometown. I sat next to an older woman my mother often chatted with at church. For the first time that day, I felt a bit safe, until I saw him. He boarded too, and sat across from me, staring again. He didn't say anything, just watched. Every time I looked in his direction, he looked away. My stop came. I got off. It was dark now. The streetlights were sparse. I began walking fast, head down, trying to shake the dread curling in my stomach. Then I heard it. That same piano tune. Same strange language. I froze. It wasn't just in my head. It was real. It was him. I didn't even have to turn around. I knew it was him. The music was playing again, just as eerie, just as wrong as before. Slow piano notes like they were being played in a flooded room, and that strange low voice singing in a language I still couldn't place. Then came the footsteps. They were behind me steady, getting faster. That was all I needed. I ran. I didn't think, didn't check my phone, didn't scream, I just ran. My bag bounced against my hip. My knees still sore from the earlier stumble, but I didn't care. My only thought was, get to light, get to people. Up ahead, I saw it, my church. A small group of people stood outside, probably just finishing some evening prayer meeting or community gathering. I sprinted up the stone steps and tried to act like I belonged, like I hadn't just been fleeing from something that felt more like a nightmare than real life. When I turned around, he was gone, just like that. No footsteps, no music, no silhouette disappearing into the shadows. Gone. I stayed close to the group, blending in as best I could until the last few people left. One of the older men offered to walk me home, and I didn't say no. We didn't talk much. I was still too shaken. When I got inside my house, I locked the door and just sat in the hallway, back against the wall, listening for music that, thank God, never came. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I honestly didn't know what to say. Who would believe me? That a man, maybe the same one from 3 years ago, followed me through 3 different buses and played that same exact tune, in that same unidentifiable language? The weirdest part was, I started to forget the details. The shape of his face, the clothes he wore, even what his voice sounded like. But I never forgot the music. Even now, years later, I still hear that melody sometimes. Not out loud, not through speakers or headphones, but in my head. When I'm tired, when I'm alone at a bus stop, when I'm walking home and there's no one else on the street. It creeps in, slow and soft, as if to remind me that he's not completely gone. That maybe he never was. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know who he was. And I don't even know for sure if it was the same man both times. But that music, it was the thread that tied it all together. And I'll never unhear it. Some houses just feel off. They don't need creaking doors or flickering lights to let. You know something isn't right. You can feel it as soon as you walk in. The house my grandparents moved into in the 1980s was one of those places. It was a large suburban home in southeast Essex, England. Not remote, not some Gothic mansion surrounded by misty woods, just a modern, spacious house with a big garden, a long concrete fence at the back, and neighbors on both sides. From the outside, it looked ideal. A place to raise 5 kids, including my mom, who was the eldest. It had everything they needed, and it was priced unusually low for what it offered. I guess they should have known that was the first red flag. When my grandparents first toured the house, they both mentioned afterward, casually, that the upstairs landing made them feel uneasy, like they were being watched. But they shrugged it off. A little paranoia in a big empty house wasn't enough to walk away from what seemed like a dream deal. For a while, everything was fine. The kids adjusted. The house was filled with noise and laughter. But then my Uncle John, who was around 13 at the time, saw something that none of us would ever forget. It was a bright afternoon, and he was playing in the back garden near the sloped end that met the high concrete wall at the rear. The sun was out. Everything felt normal until he looked up and saw someone standing in the upstairs hallway window. It was a figure, tall and still, framed in shadow but familiar. The shape, the height, the hair, it looked just like my mother, who was 18 then. The figure slowly raised its arm and beckoned to him. Without thinking, he dropped what he was doing and ran inside, calling out her name. But when he got to the top of the stairs, the hallway was empty. All the bedroom doors were open. The landing was completely still. Puzzled, he went looking for her. He finally found our grandmother out in the garage, painting. She was the only person home. She told him she hadn't been upstairs at all, and she hadn't seen anyone come in or out of the house since the morning. Uncle John didn't know what to think. He didn't talk about it much at first, but from that day on, the atmosphere in the house began to change. Little by little, things started to escalate. At first, it was just sounds, the faint noise of crying coming from the upstairs bathroom, always late at night. Sometimes it was more like whispering. Sometimes it sounded like someone softly sobbing behind a closed door. But when anyone went to check, the bathroom would be empty. Lights off, water off, no one there. Other times, they would hear scratching, banging from inside the walls. My mom described it like someone using their fingernails to claw at the plaster from the inside, like they were trying to dig their way out. And then came the shadows. You'd catch them out of the corner of your eye, moving from one room to another, standing in doorways, sitting on beds, just watching. Always gone the moment you turned your head, but the weight of their gaze lingered in the air. Eventually, my grandmother started to ask around. She approached one of the neighbors, a woman named Kathy, who had lived next door for years. Grandma didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, but something was happening in that house, and she wanted answers. What Kathy told her changed everything. Before our family had moved in, a large Chinese family had lived there. Kathy had known them well. She said the mother had suffered from severe depression and had taken her own life in the upstairs bathroom, slashing her wrist in the tub. After her death, the rest of the family moved out quickly and never looked back. They were devastated. Kathy also mentioned something strange. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, the family would return to the alleyway behind the concrete garden wall, say prayers, and throw flowers over the fence into the garden. Grandma was shaken, but still didn't want to believe in something supernatural. She tried to push the story out of her mind, but a month later, a fresh bouquet of flowers appeared in the garden. No explanation. Just tossed over the wall. That was when the fear became real. My grandfather, trying to restore some sense of control, decided to renovate the upstairs bathroom. New tiles, new fittings, new everything. He wanted to erase whatever memories still lingered there. Big mistake. That's when the activity exploded. The crying became screaming. The scratching turned into violent pounding. Doors slammed in the middle of the night. Footsteps echoed up and down the stairs when everyone was asleep. My mom would tell me how she'd be walking through the hallway and feel someone grab her hair, yanking it just hard enough to make her stop and turn, only to find no one there. The fear reached a point where my grandfather gave up on fixing things. He stopped the renovations and left the upstairs bathroom untouched. From that moment forward, no one dared to change anything else. It was as if disturbing the space made whatever was there angry. Years passed, and slowly, the children moved out. My grandfather died not long after. My grandmother stayed in the house alone. She never complained about being scared, but she also never went upstairs again. She moved her bedroom downstairs and began using the small bathroom in the garage. When asked why, she just said it was easier on her back. But I never believed that. She would clam up when asked about the upstairs. Her tone would shift, and she'd change the subject. This was a woman who had never lied to me, who never dodged hard topics. But whatever she saw, whatever she knew, she took it to her grave. I used to visit the house often as a kid, long before I knew any of this. Even then, I refused to go upstairs. I didn't know why. I just didn't want to. That part of the house felt cold, empty, in a way that didn't make sense. I always used the downstairs bathroom, even when it meant walking outside in the rain. When my grandmother passed in 2013, my mom and her siblings tried to sell the house. No one would buy it. Some people said it felt off. One couple said they couldn't sleep there. They kept hearing things at night. Another walked through the front door, stood for a few minutes, then turned around and left without saying a word. Eventually, the house was left empty. The only ones who go inside now are family, my mom, my aunts, a few cousins, just to maintain it and keep things from falling into disrepair. But no one stays overnight, and no one touches the upstairs. It's been over a decade, and the house just sits there, beautiful on the outside, perfectly preserved and utterly silent. But those of us who've been inside, we know the truth. That place remembers, and whatever lives in the upstairs bathroom hasn't left. I've never been the kind of person who believes in the paranormal. Ghosts, spirits, curses. That stuff always felt like stories people told to scare themselves or make sense of random events. I was the guy who scoffed at haunted house tales and rolled my eyes when friends talked about energy and presences. But something happened to me in college that I still can't explain, and no matter how much time passes, I find myself remembering it again and again, just to make sure I haven't twisted the memory or made it worse or more ridiculous than it really was. It happened during a week I stayed over at my girlfriend's apartment. Her name was Tara, and she lived in a small unit on the top floor of an old brick building near campus. It had creaky floors, thin walls, and a weird smell of old plaster and cinnamon, which she said came from the tenants downstairs. Nothing unusual, but during that week, I started having dreams. Not just any dreams, vivid, unsettling ones that made my skin crawl even after I woke up. That in itself was odd, because I rarely remembered my dreams. Maybe once every few months, and even then it was blurry. But now, every night, like clockwork, I'd wake up at nearly the same time, heart racing, mouth dry, and that sick feeling in my stomach like something was terribly wrong. The dreams were always centered around the same figure. I can still see it clearly, even now, years later. It was tall, impossibly tall, and had this strange, exaggerated body. Long, thin arms and legs that bent at odd angles, and a narrow chest that looked stretched. But what really unsettled me was its head. It had the shape of a dog's skull-elongated snout, upright ears, black eyes that didn't blink. It reminded me of those Egyptian statues, the ones of Anubis, the god of death. That was the closest thing I could compare it to. But this thing was no statue. It moved, and not in a natural way. In my dreams, it would always approach from the same distance. First I'd hear it, not any sound I can describe, but something inside me would sense its presence. Then I'd see it, doing this jerky, frantic dance. Its arms would flail above its head in a wild, unnatural rhythm, like those inflatable figures they place in front of car dealerships to catch your attention. That's exactly what it looked like, but without any of the humor or silliness. It was terrifying. The way it moved was like it wasn't even fully in control of its limbs. Something about it made my body freeze with a kind of primal fear I can't explain. It would just keep dancing its way toward me, getting closer and closer, and the dream would always end before it reached me. I had that same dream 3 nights in a row. The 4th night is when everything changed. I remember waking up suddenly. My chest felt tight and the room was freezing. But what really jolted me was this overwhelming feeling of danger, like I wasn't alone in the room. I turned my head and saw Tara beside me. Her eyes opened at the exact same moment as mine. No words, just this sudden connection, like we both knew something was horribly wrong. We both sat up in silence, staring at each other. The room felt heavy, like the air had weight. And then we noticed it. Around the bedroom, her hats were everywhere. Tara had a collection of hats, barrettes, sun hats, knitted ones. They were all supposed to be in a clear plastic storage bin tucked in her closet. But now, there was one on the lamp, another hanging off the doorknob, one resting on her stationary bike, a few draped over her desk. It was like someone had taken the time to place them intentionally all around the room while we slept. Neither of us moved for several seconds. We just stared, not speaking, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. My mind was screaming at me to leave. I didn't even fully register it at first, but in my head it was like a repeating alarm. Get out, get out, get out. We didn't even talk about it. We just threw off the blanket, jumped out of bed barefoot, and left the apartment as fast as we could. We didn't even grab our shoes. We didn't go back that night, or the next. In fact, I never slept at her place again. What's strangest is that after that night, the dream stopped. Completely. I've never seen that figure again in my sleep, and I've never felt that same dread since. But I think about it often, especially late at night. I worry sometimes that I've misremembered something, that maybe I exaggerated it or imagined details that weren't there. But every time I question it, I force myself to walk through it all again, point by point, because I don't want to forget. I don't want to change the memory. As terrifying as it was, I need to hold on to the truth of it, exactly how it happened. And the truth is, that thing in my dreams, whatever it was, felt like more than just a nightmare. It felt like a warning, something I still don't understand, and maybe I never will. My grandfather's company has been in the timber and mining business for as long as I can remember. A few decades back, they were trying to expand operations into more remote areas, and that led them to this isolated region in the southern hills of a small Southeast Asian country. It was a quiet, mostly undeveloped place, surrounded by thick forest and accessible only by a single dirt road. The idea was to establish a small satellite office there to manage local logging rights and build trust with the villagers. They found a house almost immediately. It was absurdly cheap, so cheap, in fact, that my grandfather joked it must come with ghosts included. The building was large enough to serve both as a home and an office. The upper floors were residential, while the lower level would be converted into workspace. My grandfather didn't believe in superstitions, and when the locals warned him against buying the place, he brushed it off completely. The villagers were persistent, though. They said the house was cursed. Every family who'd ever lived there had died violently, they claimed. No one in the village would go near it after sunset. They said the place was built on sacred land, or that something evil had taken root in the foundations long ago. I don't know the full details because my grandfather didn't believe in any of it. He thought it was just talk old stories meant to keep outsiders away. So he bought the property. The man he sent to set up the office was a mid-level manager named Rajiv. He brought his wife and 3 young children and moved into the top floor. The plan was simple: get the office running, hire some locals, and set up a reliable supply chain. Rajiv was efficient, smart, and had no problem living off the grid for a while. At first, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Then the silence started. After a few weeks of regular updates, my grandfather stopped hearing from him. No calls, no letters, no reports. At first, he assumed it was a power issue, no surprise in that part of the world. Maybe they'd lost access to communication lines or were dealing with supply shortages. He waited a few more weeks. Still nothing. Eventually, he contacted the local authorities and asked them to check on the property. He even offered to pay for the trip, just to get someone to go up there and knock on the door. A few days later, he received a call from the village chief. His voice was shaking. When the police arrived at the house, the front door was locked from the inside. There was no response, no sign of movement. They broke in through one of the back windows and made their way upstairs. What they found was beyond horrific. Rajiv had murdered his wife and 3 children. Not with a gun or poison or anything quick. He had used a machete. That's what the report said. A single rusted blade, likely one of the tools used for clearing vegetation around the property. The details were hard to swallow, even in written form. His children had been found in their beds. His wife was discovered in the hallway, possibly trying to protect them. Then, somehow, Rajiv had turned the blade on himself. The report claimed he'd hacked into his own body with enough force to cause fatal wounds. There were things that didn't make sense. The bed the family had been sleeping on, a large, antique thing with a solid oak frame, had been used to block the bedroom door from the inside. It weighed well over 200 pounds. No one could explain how he moved it alone, especially with the bodies already on top of it. Some believed he did it to trap himself in the room. Others said it was evidence that something else had taken over, something inhuman. The police didn't release photos. They didn't have to. The chief's description alone was enough to scar my grandfather. He told me later that there was blood on the ceiling splattered in a way that suggested more than just physical violence. Some of the locals believed the spirits had flung the bodies into the air. Others whispered about ancient curses, about angry gods. One man swore he'd seen something standing in the window the night before the police arrived. He wouldn't say what. My grandfather tried to keep the entire thing quiet. He paid off the right people, officials, police, even a couple of journalists who'd caught wind of the story. In that part of the country, money can move mountains. Eventually, the death was classified as a murder-suicide, attributed to psychological breakdown. Officially, that's all it ever was. He still needed someone to take over the office. The house, though cleaned, was never quite the same. Word got around, even though the gory details were hidden. Everyone knew the last guy had died. No one wanted to go near it. My grandfather offered bonuses, titles, even company cars to anyone willing to relocate. It didn't work. Finally, he handpicked a younger employee, Michael, I think his name was, and gave him a hefty promotion. Told him he was in charge of the new Southeast Division and needed to be on site to supervise the setup. The guy lasted less than 24 hours. He drove up, took one look at the house, and left the keys on the gate before catching the next bus back to the city. He quit the following week. The house still stands. No one's lived in it since. Locals won't go near it. My grandfather wrote off the entire project eventually and sold the property for a fraction of the price, just to be rid of it. To this day, he refuses to talk about what happened. He says it was just one man losing his mind in the middle of nowhere. But I've always wondered. Rajiv had no history of violence, no signs of depression or instability. His last letter had been full of optimism, plans for the new office, questions about paint colors, a list of furniture he wanted to order. Then, within days, it all went silent. And the machete. That still bothers me. Who kills themselves with a machete? How do you do that to your own body? And why the bed? Why barricade the door after everything? I'm not saying I believe in curses, but sometimes, when I think about that house, its rotting beams, the cold wind from the jungle, the silence surrounding it, I start to wonder if the villagers were right all along. I grew up in an old two-story house in a small town in upstate New York. It was one of those houses you pass by and immediately know it has been standing for over a century. The place was built in the year 1912, with thick wooden frames, creaky floors, and the kind of drafty windows that never really keep out the cold. My parents bought it before I was born, and I spent my entire childhood inside those walls. For the most part, it felt like a normal home. But there were little things, details I pushed aside back then that never really added up. The room I grew up in had a closet that backed into a narrow crawl space. It wasn't a standard one. The opening was small, maybe 3 feet wide, and a little over 3 feet tall, just enough for someone to squeeze through if they really tried. It led to the crawl space behind the master bedroom's closets on the other side of the house. Those closets had proper panels that opened into it. Mine didn't. Just a dark hole that always gave me a bad feeling. My parents said it was nothing, just a weird leftover from how homes used to be built, but I never went in there. Even as a kid, something about it scared me too much. I'd sometimes sit on my bed and stare at that dark square on the wall, feeling like if I blinked too long, something would be crawling out of it. Years passed, and I forgot about it. Then came the summer before my last year of high school. We were renovating the house, mostly the upstairs area. The insulation in the attic had started to break down, and my dad decided we'd replace it ourselves to save some money. At the time, the only access to the attic was through this tiny square panel in the ceiling of one of the side rooms. No proper ladder, just a stool and a flashlight. The attic had always made me uneasy. Occasionally, as a kid, I'd wake up and notice the attic panel slightly pushed upward, like it had been opened or hadn't closed properly. I chalked it up to drafts or maybe my dad checking on something, though he always denied going up there. We never talked about it. Anyway, during the renovation, we had to carefully move around on beams since the attic floor wasn't finished. Step in the wrong place and your foot could punch right through the ceiling below. I was laying out insulation when I realized the attic extended much farther back than I ever imagined. Beyond the main space, past a wall of old wooden beams, it dipped lower, almost like a hidden section. Curious, I ducked through a narrow opening and found myself in what looked like a hidden little room built on top of the porch roof. It was barely lit, just a bit of daylight seeping in through warped slats in the siding. The floor felt soft in some places, unsafe, but I could still stand. The air smelled thick, like dust and mold and old paper. And right in the center of this space, sitting alone, was a small wooden chair. A child's chair. It was painted white once, but the color had faded to this sickly gray-yellow. One leg was chipped. It stood perfectly upright in the middle of the room, like someone had placed it there and never moved it again. I froze. There was something deeply unsettling about how untouched it looked. Not dusty, not covered in cobwebs. Just sitting there, waiting. Next to it, lying flat on the floor, was a wooden board, maybe half an inch thick and about the size of a large book. It looked handmade, like it had been carved out of scrap wood. I picked it up and saw names etched into it. 5 in total, 1 in each corner and 1 dead center. The carvings were shallow at the corners, faded, almost unfinished. But the name in the middle was different. It was mine. Not just my name, but the exact spelling, which has always been a bit unusual. I'd met maybe 2 other people in my life who spelled it the same way. But there it was, cut deeply into the wood, more precise than the others, and covered in what looked like dried red paint, or something meant to resemble it. It had been carefully traced over, as if someone wanted to make sure that name never faded. I stared at it for a long time. My brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe a coincidence. Maybe it belonged to someone else with the same name who lived in the house decades before. But the board didn't look old enough for that. The style of the lettering, the texture of the paint, everything about it felt recent. Or at least preserved, like someone had gone out of their way to keep it hidden and protected. I felt sick. I didn't tell my parents. I just left the attic, went outside, and stayed there for the rest of the day. The next week, we finished the work on the porch roof, and I made sure the chair and board were taken out and tossed. I never looked at them again. Part of me wanted to burn them, but I didn't want to explain why. I still think about it sometimes. I've gone over every possible explanation. Could someone have been messing with me? Maybe one of my brothers playing a joke? But they wouldn't have known about that crawl space. Nobody ever went up there except during the renovations, and no one had access to that part of the attic. You'd have to know the house intimately to even find that little room. What haunts me most is that the attic is directly above the crawl space behind my closet. And as much as I hate admitting it, I sometimes wonder if there was something in this house that always knew my name. Something that had been waiting for me to find it. It started like most dumb teenage decisions do with boredom. A few of us were hanging out at my place one night with nothing better to do than try to scare each other with ghost stories. It was the usual routine, half-joking tailies, exaggerated whispers, someone slamming a door at the perfect time to get a scream out of the group. Just harmless fun. My girlfriend at the time had lived in the area longer than any of us, and when it was her turn to tell a story, she leaned forward and said, "You guys know about the old mental hospital, right?" None of us had heard about it. She explained it was only about a half-hour drive from where we were. It had been shut down for years, maybe decades, and supposedly the place still had underground tunnels that connected some of the buildings. According to her, they were built to keep pipes warm in winter and for staff to move patients without taking them outside. She said parts of those tunnels were still accessible if you knew where to look. It was late. We were tired. But curiosity is a hell of a drug. Within the hour, we were in someone's car, driving toward a place that was never meant to be visited again. The hospital was barely visible through the trees. A long-abandoned collection of broken windows and caved-in roofs, nature had started reclaiming it. Vines crept up its sides, and the gravel lot in front was cracked with weeds pushing through. We parked a little down the road and walked in under the moonlight, flashlights barely cutting through the thick dark. Inside, the place was as creepy as you'd expect, empty halls echoing our footsteps, paint peeling from the walls, graffiti scrawled across half-collapsed doors. We were cautious, but still laughing, talking too loud, occasionally daring one another to go further ahead. Eventually, we found a stairwell leading down, the basement. We didn't think much of it. We were just excited that we'd found something. At the bottom was a long concrete corridor. Pipes ran along the walls, rusted and dripping, and at the far end was a large metal door, slightly ajar. It groaned when we pushed it open, and that's when we saw it. A tunnel. It stretched ahead, perfectly straight and far longer than our flashlights could reach. Just a dark corridor with no visible end, like it had been swallowed by night itself. The air felt heavier, damp and cold like a storm cellar. I stepped forward, shined my light as far as it would go. That's when I saw it. Something shifted just barely far down the hall. A shape moved, silent and slow. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but then the shape slid fully into view. It wasn't standing. It was crouched in a doorway I hadn't noticed before, maybe 10 or 15 feet into the tunnel. Its back was against the wall, knees pulled to its chest, long bony arms draped over its shins. The skin was stretched tight over its body, pale like candle wax, almost bluish in tone. And the eyes. God, the eyes. They were too big, round, like softballs jammed into its skull. They glowed faintly, with a strange yellowish blue light, like cat eyes reflecting in headlights. I was crouched, frozen, flashlight locked onto it. I didn't even call out. I couldn't. Then I heard something. Not out loud, in my head. A voice not human, not emotionless either, but distant and too calm. Come on down here. Come see what we have. Come over. Come on. The words looped gently, like a lullaby. They weren't spoken. They were placed inside my mind, clear and deliberate. And I stepped forward, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. My foot moved on its own. Every cell in my body screamed to turn around and run, but I couldn't. I felt like a puppet, like my limbs didn't belong to me anymore. My muscles were jelly, my thoughts fogged. I stepped closer, and then something else happened. A second voice, also inside my head, cut through the haze, sharper, urgent. Run. It wasn't a whisper. It was a command. In that instant, I snapped out of it. I stumbled backward, almost dropped my flashlight, and turned to bolt up the stairs. Go, I shouted, and my friends who'd been just behind me, joking moments before, saw the panic in my face and didn't ask questions. We ran like hell. Up the stairs, down the cracked hallways, out the shattered front doors, and across the weed-riddled lot. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. We piled in, gasping for breath, hearts pounding. No one said a word for a while. We drove straight to the nearest White Castle, the only thing open that late. We sat in the parking lot, trying to make sense of what just happened, trying to laugh it off, but no one really could. When we got out of the car to go inside, someone noticed something strange on the back of the vehicle. Handprints. Long, thin prints smeared across the rear window and the bumper. Like someone had pressed their hands there, only the fingers were too long, the shape unnatural. We hadn't seen anyone behind us. We hadn't heard anything following us. But something had touched the car. We still try to explain it, to make it make sense. Maybe someone was living in the tunnels. Maybe it was some sort of weird collective hallucination brought on by adrenaline. Maybe the handprints were already there and we just noticed them after the fact. Maybe. But I know what I saw. And I know what I heard. Something down there called to me. And something else pulled me back. Whatever's down in those tunnels, whatever it is, it wanted me. It was waiting. And I never want to know what would have happened if I'd taken one more step. This happened when I was serving in the Navy. Out of all the wild experiences I had on the ship, this one stuck with me the most. It was the kind of thing that no matter how many times I go over it in my head, I still can't find a way to rationalize. And trust me, I've tried. We were docked at shore, doing routine inventory. I had been assigned to the lowest level of the ship where we kept our freezer, this massive industrial cold room that spanned nearly the entire base of the vessel. It held all our frozen supplies: meat, seafood, packaged meals, vegetables, ice, you name it. The place was basically a maze of stacked boxes, some even piled above head height. You had to climb and squeeze through gaps to count stock properly. The air down there was different. Not just cold dead. You couldn't hear anything but your own footsteps crunching against the metal floor. No ship creaking. No distant voices. Just silence. And cold. Freezing cold. I'm Hawaiian, born and raised, so no matter how many coats I layered on, I never quite got used to that kind of chill. The kind that eats into your bones. So there I was, head down, coat zipped up to my chin, pen and clipboard in hand, crawling over boxes and trying to finish my count. I had probably been down there about 20 minutes when I heard footsteps behind me. Light ones. That was strange. Most of the guys on board wore heavy boots. Even the lightest step echoed like a hammer down there. But these steps were soft, quick. I assumed it was one of the other crewmen messing around. Maybe someone looking for snacks or cutting through to get to another section. I turned to look, and there she was. A little girl, standing a few feet away from me. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. Pale skin, long black hair, wearing this outdated red polka dot dress. Just standing there in the middle of the freezing room, barefoot, staring up at me. I froze. Not just because of the cold. For a few seconds, I was so stunned that I didn't even think to speak. Then I realized we were docked. Tours were allowed sometimes when we weren't in deployment, and officers did occasionally bring family aboard. She had to be someone's daughter. Maybe she got lost. I forced a smile and said, "Hey, sweetheart, you're not supposed to be down here. Are your parents nearby?" No response. She just kept staring. Her eyes were wide, but there was no fear in them. No confusion. Just observation. "Would you like me to take you back up?" I asked, trying again. She didn't answer. She turned slowly and started walking away. Only her movement wasn't normal. It was subtle at first. She didn't walk like a kid. She glided, kind of like she was underwater. A jerky glide, slow, then fast, then slow again. Like someone skipping through frames in a video. Then she picked up speed. Not running. Not walking faster. more like snapping forward in little jolts, each motion too sudden, too sharp. Her arms didn't swing. Her feet barely touched the ground. I stepped back. Every hair on my body was standing straight up. She turned a corner between two stacks of frozen food. I should have reported it right then. Should have called it in on my radio. But something in the part that still needed to believe it was a real little girl, made me follow. I turned the corner after her. Nothing. The aisle was empty. I ran out of the freezer, heart slamming in my chest, breath clouding in the air like smoke. I scrambled up the ladder well, so fast I nearly slipped twice, my gloved hands barely gripping the icy metal. When I got back to the main level, I spotted my supervisor standing by a workstation, casually observing a few other crewmen. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Hey, you okay?" he asked. I told him what I saw in full. I didn't hold back or try to dress it up. I described the girl, her clothes, how she moved, how cold it was. I expected him to laugh or roll his eyes. Tell me it was probably some officer's daughter, and to relax. But he didn't. He listened quietly. And when I finished, he looked down, sighed, and said, "There haven't been any tourists today." I blinked. What? No visitors on the ship. Not since yesterday. And definitely not down in the freezer. We lock it during tours. I felt sick. I leaned against the wall. Then he added, "I've heard of her before." I stared at him, waiting. He said, years ago, an officer had brought his family aboard during a shore visit. He was proud of his rank, proud of his work, and wanted to show his wife and daughter around. While leading them through the ship, the girl had wandered off. She slipped down a ladder well, possibly the same one I just climbed, and fell into the freezer area. It was an ugly fall. Broke her neck. She was gone before anyone even found her. Since then, some crewmen had claimed to see her. Always alone. Always silent. Always watching. Sometimes she appeared in the galley. Sometimes in the hall outside the freezer. But mostly down there in the cold. I didn't go back alone after that. Not once. From then on, whenever I had inventory duty in the freezer, I made sure at least 2 other people came with me. I didn't care what anyone thought. I'd rather be called paranoid than stand alone in that room again. To this day, I can still picture her. The way she looked up at me. The way her head tilted slightly, curious but not afraid. The way she moved. No living person moves like that. That ship's long gone from my life, but I still talk to a few guys I served with. Some laugh when I bring it up. Others go quiet. One guy admitted he heard the footsteps once. He never told anyone. I'm not saying I believe in ghosts, not in the traditional sense. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And whatever that little girl was, it wasn't alive. It's been over a decade, but I still remember the dream in perfect detail, down to the warmth of the room, the fabric of the couch, even the quiet peace I felt when I saw him. That's how I knew it wasn't just a dream. I was about 12 when it happened. Old enough to remember things clearly, but still too young to explain what I'd experienced without being brushed off. My grandfather, on my mom's side, hadn't been part of my life for years by then. He was a heavy smoker and an alcoholic, and whatever relationship he had with us had long since broken down. I didn't know him well. In fact, I hadn't even thought about him in years. But that night, he came back. In the dream, everything was quiet. I was in the living room, not ours, but it felt familiar somehow. Like it had been pieced together from memories and places I'd only half seen. The walls were warm beige, and the lighting was soft and dim, as if the sun was setting somewhere just out of view. And there he was, lying on the couch, stretched out comfortably, a peaceful expression on his face. He wasn't sick. He wasn't coughing or thin or gray like in the few memories I had of him. He looked healthy, still-aged, sure, but content. He looked finished. In a strange way, I felt proud of him. like he'd finally found rest. He was dead though. I knew that. Even in the dream, I understood that this wasn't some reunion. He was gone. But I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel sadness. I felt peace, an overwhelming, almost numbing calm, like everything was exactly how it should be. I just stood there watching him, absorbing the quiet. And then I woke up. There was no jolt, no gasp for air. Just a slow transition back to my bed, to morning light filtering through the window, to the muffled sound of the TV downstairs. I got up and walked into the living room where my mom was sitting on the couch, watching some talk show. I sat down beside her, still groggy. She glanced at me and gave me a faint smile. I don't remember exactly what I said. I think it was something simple like, I had a dream about Grandpa. She looked at me strangely, but before she could respond, the phone rang. She picked it up, and within seconds, I saw her face change. It was subtle at first, just her eyes narrowing slightly, her body tensing. Then the tears started. She was quiet on the call, nodding, murmuring the occasional "I understand" or "thank you." When she hung up, she sat there, hands in her lap, trying to gather herself. I already knew. I could feel it. "I have to tell you something," she said gently. But I cut her off. "I already know. Grandpa died." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look surprised. Not really. More like she had just confirmed something she already felt. We both sat in silence for a while after that. She didn't ask how I knew, and I didn't tell her. It was like neither of us needed an explanation. Later that day, we got more details. He had passed away in his sleep sometime during the night. The doctors believed it was a stroke. My grandmother, his wife, had been asleep in the bedroom while he was on the living room couch. She didn't know he was gone until she got up in the morning and found him still lying there, peaceful and still. When I heard that, my skin prickled, because in the dream, that's exactly where he was on the couch, smiling faintly, looking like he just drifted off. It was the same pose, same lighting, same eerie sense of closure. I didn't tell anyone else about the dream. Not for a long time. It wasn't something I felt like I needed to share or explain. But it stayed with me. It stays with me still. I think what made it so haunting wasn't just the timing. It was how right it all felt. I hadn't thought about him. I hadn't missed him. And yet, when he appeared in my dream, it felt like we both knew something was being tied off. That despite all the pain and distance, something had come full circle. Years later, when I did finally talk to my mom about it again, she nodded slowly and said, "I think he wanted to say goodbye. Maybe that's all it was. Maybe she's right. Maybe it was some deep buried part of my subconscious reacting to something I couldn't consciously know. Maybe it was just coincidence." But here's the thing, I never dreamed about him before that. And I've never dreamed about him since. It was a one-time visit. And everything about it, the warmth, the timing, the way I already knew before the phone call, tells me it was real. Not a ghost in the traditional sense. Not a haunting. Just a message. A moment. A quiet farewell. Sometimes I think that's all the supernatural is: unfinished conversations. Quiet exits, one last look to let you know it's okay to move on. I don't know what comes after this life, and maybe I never will. But I believe some part of my grandfather waited until I could see him one more time, not as the man who drank himself into silence, but as someone whole. Someone who could finally rest. And that dream, it gave me peace too.